The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has pushed several economies and countries to the brink. The Philippines just declared a state of national energy emergency and is already rationing fuel. India just initiated emergency deepwater drilling to tap its offshore reserves and avoid a supply collapse. Countries across Oceania, including Australia and New Zealand, are weighing national energy emergencies as import routes freeze.
I'm on a quarter of a tank. I've been driving for about 500 kilometers and not a drop of diesel anywhere. This is a service station that's run completely out of diesel, and these trucks here are all waiting. And this is like this across South Australia and now Victoria.
New Zealand now even announced that nearly 150,000 families will soon receive a weekly cash payment to help them afford gas. Meanwhile, gas prices in the US and Canada have also soared, with gas prices in the US climbing to $3.94 as of this morning, March 26th. But thus far, the US has avoided a 1970s-style oil shortage. One reason is that domestic production provides a vital buffer, as the US is now the world's largest producer of oil and gas. The White House is also taking emergency steps to keep fuel prices from exploding.
Well, we have a coalition for them, but they should have been up here a long time ago. And they're affected. The amazing thing is we don't need the Hormuz Strait. We don't need it. We don't need it at all. We have so much oil. Our country is not affected by this. We have twice the amount of oil as Saudi Arabia or Russia.
One specific move was temporarily waiving the Jones Act, which is a 1920 maritime law that requires all goods transported by water between U.S. ports to be carried on ships built, owned, and crewed by Americans. This strict requirement severely limits the number of available cargo vessels, and suspending the law temporarily allows foreign tankers to move oil between American ports. As a result, domestic fuel can't be transported with fewer delays. This emergency waiver also exposes a permanent friction point in the American economy. These domestic shipping rules function as a hidden tax on everything from gasoline to groceries. Follow and subscribe for more daily updates. Joining us now to explain how these policies drive up your cost of living is Colin Grabow, Associate Director of the Cato Institute's Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies. And don't forget to subscribe to my Briefs channel, shorter 10-minute clips, link down below. Colin, good to see you. Welcome to the show.
David, thank you very much. We'll look forward to the conversation.
Look forward to it as well. Let me play for you a clip of Trump talking about affordability. And we'll start there. Take a listen.
After gasoline skyrocketed to over $5 a gallon and in some places $7, $8, and even $9 a gallon under Biden, our policies have brought gas prices way down, and now at $2.37 a gallon. But I was in a beautiful place called Iowa 2 weeks ago, $1.85 a gallon for gasoline. Way down. All of it's come down. We inherited a mess with high prices and high inflation, and we've turned it around and we've made it great. And they don't mention, like I said before, they don't mention the word affordability, Kelly. They don't mention it. I haven't heard the word in 2 weeks because they can't get away with the gig. It's all a con job with them. Airfares, hotels, car payments, rent, sports events, groceries. Everything's down. Everything's down. Dairy, eggs, potatoes and chicken. Core inflation is now the lowest of any time in more than 7 years.
Can you just evaluate what he said so far and maybe just get your perspective on whether or not any of that is true? And if prices have indeed come down for certain goods and gasoline in some cases, how much can we attribute that to a little-known law called the Jones Act?
Yeah, so it's interesting to listen to the president's comments talk about rising affordability when, of course, the president has made a big priority trying to increase the price of goods through his tariff-led trade agenda. So tariffs, of course, are taxes paid by Americans on imported goods. They raise the cost of things to Americans. This is totally antithetical, I think, to an agenda of making things more affordable. So it was difficult for me to square that with some of his rhetoric. I don't have a car, so I don't drive a lot. I don't pay attention to the price of gas, but I do go grocery shopping, among other things. And his talk about lower prices do not comport with my own personal experience. I don't think it comports with the experience of a lot of other Americans. And frankly, I don't think it comports with the available data either.
What can the government do to bring down prices? We mentioned waiving the Jones Act, we'll talk about in more detail in just a minute. But are there any other initiatives that Congress can take to make affordability, I guess, more of a reality for mainstream Americans?
Yeah, I think there are lots of policy levers available to both policymakers on the federal and state level to increase affordability. A great place to start with the tariffs. The president has made that a priority of his, but ultimately Congress can override him. They have the power to take away these tariffs and remove them. So I think it'd be very welcome if they would act. That would be an immediate tax cut for Americans to provide welcome relief. There's any number of rules and regulations that could be relaxed or dispensed with entirely. It's interesting that within the past couple of weeks, that we've, of course, had the Jones Act waiver. We've also talked about suspending, I think, the renewable fuel standard, other means of making gasoline more affordable. So policymakers know that there are laws in the books that drive up the cost of living for Americans. And I think that revisiting them, this is a very apt time to take a fresh look at some of the things the government does on both the federal and state level that increases the cost of living for Americans.
What happens when gas goes north of where it is right now? So $5 a gallon for diesel, historic highs. At what point does the economy break, Colin?
Good question. I'm not an energy economist. Thankfully, our economy has become less dependent on fossil fuels, and also we're more energy efficient. We can get more economic growth per unit of energy input, so that helps. But let's not make any mistake or be under the illusion that these don't have significant negative implications for our economy. We need energy to move our economy, quite literally. So rising costs of diesel, for example. Well, so much of what we move around this country goes by truck. That is bad for trucking companies for the cost of transportation. Of course, transportation costs reverberate throughout our economy. So clearly this is a negative. The only question is exactly the magnitude of how bad it is.
Well, if the Fed has kept rates unchanged, what should be the correct policy going forward?
Not a central banker, thank goodness. I don't pretend to have a good handle on what our interest rates should be. I'll defer to the experts on that one.
With the Fed battling the inflation side, rising inflation concerns, as well as higher unemployment, Congress has to take measures. New Zealand, like I mentioned in the introduction, has taken the initiative to provide low-income families up to $150,000, I've read, with cash to fight higher gas prices. Is that something that the American Congress should consider as well?
Well, I would favor policies, again, that drive up, taking a fresh look at policies that drive up the cost of living for Americans. I think just taking taxpayer money and redistributing it is the easy button. The harder and more necessary option is to revisit a lot of the laws that we have on the books that drive up costs and introduce inefficiencies into our economy. But that's hard. So, of course, governments prefer to spend other people's money rather than tackle those laws and the interest groups that support them.
Before we continue with the video, I'd like to bring to your attention something that's perhaps even more valuable and important than your investment portfolio, and that's your personal data and your privacy. Now, your personal information is more accessible than you may think, and that's where today's sponsor, Delete Me, comes in. Data brokers and search websites gather and sell details like your name, home address, phone number, and even family connections, sometimes without you even realizing it. Delete Me is a service I use to help me limit that exposure. Setup takes only a few minutes, and after that, their team handles everything. They identify where your information appears, confirm those listings, and submit removal requests to hundreds of data broker websites. They also continue monitoring over time since this data can reappear. I've been personally using it for over a year now, and they've reviewed over 325 listings for my information. The reports show exactly what was found and what was removed, which makes the process transparent. If you want to check it out, go to joindeleteme.com/DavidLin, link in the description down below, or scan the QR code here to get started. Use my code DavidLin for 20% off. Get started and protect your privacy today. Well, the Supreme Court has ruled against and struck down the IEEPA tariffs. But as you'll recall, President Trump actually doubled down and is now looking for workarounds. So in short, are we expecting a wind down of tariffs going forward?
Tariffs will very much be a story for the months and probably years ahead. As you mentioned, the Supreme Court struck down the IEEPA tariffs, deeming that they were not within the president's authority to impose. However, the president does have plenty of other authorities to impose tariffs, and he's signaled a willingness and desire to make use of them. So we can expect more tariffs imposed under, for example, Section 301 or Section 232. These are national security tariffs. Section 301 is designed to combat unfair trade practices by other countries. So they will very much be looking for ways of substituting the tariffs that they had under the IEEPA with replacing them with tariffs imposed under new authorities. The president remains very committed to a tariff-led trade agenda, and I don't see any sign that either he will divert from that or the Congress will do its job and reclaim that authority and eliminate these tariffs.
That leads us to talk about shipping. Earlier in the month, you recall that we saw headlines like this: Trump waives the Jones Act shipping restrictions in latest bid to ease gas prices. The White House is temporarily lifting key limits on the shipping of oil, gas, and other commodities through the United States in its effort to counter rising energy prices sparked by its war with Iran. Let's talk about this. Why have headlines been made around the Jones Act? What is it? Give us a brief history, and then we can talk about its implications.
Yes. So the Jones Act is Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which essentially states that to move goods by water within the United States, you have to use a vessel that is U.S. flagged and registered, that is crewed by Americans, that is at least 75% owned by Americans, and that is built here in the United States. Now, the impact of this law is that it makes shipping incredibly more expensive than what you find internationally where the Jones Act does not apply. So we're talking about energy here. Let's talk about tankers. A product tanker used to move, say, jet fuel or motor gasoline, for example. To build one in Asia right now costs around $50 million. The latest estimated price to build one here in the United States that complies with the Jones Act is at least $240 million. And that's just the capital expense. Then you have the operating expenses. American flagged ships have annual operating expenses of around $11.5 million. Internationally flagged ships, less than $3 million. And there's not a lot to choose from. To serve the needs of the world's biggest economy, we have 54 tankers, of which 43 are product tankers to move fuel around. That's out of a global population of around 7,500. So you take ships that are few in number, expensive to build, expensive to operate, you're going to get very costly shipping.
But ultimately, how is this going to alleviate energy stress, given that the U.S. produces most of its energy? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we produce energy. We have a lot of places in this country that are dependent on water transportation to receive their energy. For example, Florida they are not connected to pipelines. So they rely on shipping to ship in gas from the Gulf Coast. Hawaii, Puerto Rico, obviously shipping dependent. Also, the Northeast, they are pipeline constrained. Colonial Pipeline terminates in New York Harbor, so that has to be taken. A lot of that has to be taken by water up to New England. Also, California is not connected to the rest of the country's pipeline network. So, it was a few weeks ago, it was reported by Bloomberg that one of California's top sources of fuel was the Bahamas. What was happening there? Well, tankers were taking fuel components from the Gulf Coast to the Bahamas, dropping off, and it would be mixed into a new product, then taken from the Bahamas to California. All of that was to avoid the Jones Act by having two international voyages instead of one domestic voyage where the Jones Act applies.
So it's reported that U.S.-built tankers, this is from the Cato Institute, actually, it's reported that U.S.-built tankers cost on average 5 times more than some foreign-built tankers. Now, if that's the case, isn't the Jones Act basically just a hidden tax?
I think that's an excellent way of framing it. I would look at it as a hidden tax on domestic commerce, on Americans' abilities to trade and do business with one another. And we live in a huge country that spans thousands of miles. And water transportation is an efficient means of moving large quantities of goods over long distances. And unfortunately, we've made it so costly that we really only use shipping for those instances, those situations where there is no alternative, such as taking goods to islands like Hawaii, Puerto Rico, or taking goods to Alaska, or again, as I mentioned earlier, to Florida, where they have a lack of pipelines. So we've taken what should be a very efficient means of transportation and kind of taken it off the table to a large extent.
Have you or your colleagues at the Cato Institute run numbers on how commerce would be affected if the Jones Act were eliminated completely?
Yeah, so getting good numbers on exactly how much the country stands to benefit has never really been done a truly comprehensive study, but we can look at some examples out there. So, for example, there's a recent paper about a few years ago that looked at just Puerto Rico by itself. They estimated the gains were something on the order of $1.4 billion just to there. Other studies have looked at, for example, Hawaii, $1.2 billion, I think the last study. There's a study done a few years ago, looked at just fuel movements on the East Coast, and they estimated a gain to consumers of, I believe, $770 million, something like that. So there, we want to have a full comprehensive picture, but we have little pieces of evidence that suggests that on a national scale, it would be quite significant.
Well, let's take a look now at another article that the Cato Institute published. This was a while ago. Candy-coated cartel, time to kill the U.S. sugar program. You wrote this in 2018. So it's not exactly recent, but it's probably ongoing. For decades,
Yes.
The federal government has been operating a program to control the production and importation of sugar. One of the program's main purposes is to ensure minimum price levels for sugar that is typically significantly higher than those found on international markets. Give us a summary of your findings and why this is significant.
Yes. So Americans pay higher prices for sugar than pretty much every other country in the world. And this is thanks to the U.S. sugar program. It is a program that deliberately limits both the amount of domestic production as well as limits the amount of sugar that can be imported into the country. So when you restrict supply and you have consistent demand, you're going to push prices up. U.S. sugar prices tend to be, depending on the time of year, 2 to 3 times higher than what you find in other countries. This is one big reason why if you go to your local grocery store, you will see American Coke and you'll see Mexican Coke for sale. Why 2 different types of Coke? Mexican Coke, made in Mexico, with access to internationally priced sugar. It actually uses sugar. Whereas here in the United States, we rely on high fructose corn syrup, both because of the sugar program as well as our subsidies to corn that make corn artificially cheap. But it's not just soda. Think about any product that uses sugar as an input. Candy, they have to pay more. So this has resulted, for example, in candy manufacturers moving to other countries, including to Canada. Nobody is leaving the United States for Canada to go there for the cheap wages. They're going there for the access to reasonably priced sugar. So this is another, like the Jones Act, you have a relatively small number of people that profit from this. Your average American has to pay more. And it's just an ongoing story here in Washington. And that is another example of a law that Congress should be serious about getting rid of if it wants to increase affordability for Americans.
Don't we have antitrust laws against these types of cartels exactly?
Well, it's an interesting point that we do have laws that are supposed to rein in cartels and predatory corporate behavior. And then we have these laws that frankly enable this kind of behavior. I mean, the entire point of the sugar program is to make it more expensive. We can extend this to shipping as well. I think about 15 or 20 years ago or so, in Puerto Rico, the federal government convicted a group of shipping executives for colluding on prices. The only way they could do that is because of the Jones Act keeps out 99% of the world ships. So a relatively small number, you can all get together and collude and coordinate. So true antitrust exemption would try to remove import barriers, promote competition, expose more of the U.S. economy to the international marketplace.
Okay, so what do you think should be done here if we were to implement or suggest policy revisions?
Yeah, so in an ideal world, we repeal the U.S. sugar program. It's frankly obscene that we have a program whose entire purpose is just to enrich a certain subset of farmers at the expense of the rest of the United States. This serves no national security interest, no national interest of any kind. I think that's very straightforward. On the Jones Act, ideally, we get rid of this law and expand shipping to international competition. I think maybe a happy medium would be to bring the law in line with other forms of transportation, such as aircraft, where foreign carriers cannot operate within the United States, but they can use foreign-built aircraft like Airbus, for example. And I think the industry benefits tremendously from that. If American shipping companies could buy ships at 1/5 the price, I'm thinking we'd have cheaper shipping and a lot more ships to better serve the U.S. economy.
Can you think of any protectionist measures that actually benefit the American consumer? And I'm not talking about defense.
Sure. Off the top of my head, no. Almost behind every tariff you encounter, there is some special interest group that is pushing to maintain it, and there's a backstory there. Just like we see, we've been talking about sugar, we've been talking about shipping. We can add steel to the list. Of course, we have 50% tariffs on steel imports. This is, I think, quite transparently to curry favor with the steel industry that is located in the Rust Belt. These are swing states in presidential elections. They have a lot of influence. This is not about protecting American consumers. It's about lining the pockets of well-connected special interests.
Right. So let's say we eliminate things like the Jones Act, and then we get rid of cartels. What is the immediate impact on the prices of goods in places like Hawaii, for example, where it's estimated that the Jones Act costs the average family from Hawaii about $1,800 per year?
Yeah, so I think this would be a big shot in the arm for affordability there. It would put downward pressure on prices, more competition. You can bring in goods cheaper. And it's not just the goods you find on your shelf. I mean, this is also energy. Hawaii imports oil from all over the world. One place they don't get oil from is the U.S. Gulf Coast because we've made it so expensive because of the Jones Act. So we can make energy cheaper there. You get things cheaper. That makes it more appealing, more affordable for tourists to further boost their economy. So lots of wins there. But, let's not think this is a Hawaii problem or Puerto Rico problem. This is very much an American problem. I think this would be a big boost to economic growth here in the United States. If we could get the same efficient transportation we use for our imports and exports and apply that nationally, we give you one factoid I learned recently. According to a U.S. agriculture company, it costs them as much to send fertilizer from Florida to New Orleans, which is about 500 nautical miles, as to send it down to Brazil, which is roughly 5,000 nautical miles. So we could radically reduce the cost of water transportation. I think it would be wonderful for this country. And then get rid of all the other protectionist laws we discussed, remove tariffs. That's a formula for growth.
The argument for protectionism, especially tariffs and things like the Jones Act, is to protect local industries. In the case of Jones Act, presumably to protect shipbuilders in the U.S., and for tariffs to protect manufacturing within the U.S. If we don't protect these industries and the sector at large, we lose jobs, and the economy suffers even more. Do you buy that argument?
I don't buy that. No, I don't, not at all. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's just look at the evidence here. So we have the Jones Act, which again requires the use of U.S.-built ships. The theory being this ensures we have a robust, modern shipbuilding industry. Well, according to the most recent data, in 2024, the United States accounted for 0.04% of global shipbuilding output. Over the last decade, we account for something like 0.2%. We are the world's number 2 manufacturing country, and we're somewhere between 15th to 20th place when it comes to shipbuilding. It's really hard to make the case we've done any favors here. And it's also not a surprise that an industry protected from competition, not exposed to world-class competition, has become woefully uncompetitive. That seems fairly axiomatic. So I reject the idea that we're doing them any favors. But if we want to just focus purely on jobs, what's good for the American worker, what's good for American industry, I don't think the protectionism works there either. Having costly steel is not a formula for growth. How many industries out there use steel as an input? Think about autos. Think about shipbuilding. You want to help them out? Let's have them have access to internationally competitive inputs. Something like half of what Americans import are inputs used in manufacturing. So we're taxing our industry, and we're putting ourselves on the back foot in terms of our ability to compete.
Well, let's take the automobile sector as an example. So I'm based in Canada, and the government here recently, in the last couple months, reduced tariffs on Chinese EVs from 100% to 6.1%. Now, 100% is still the tariff amount that the U.S. has imposed on Chinese cars. What would happen, theoretically, if the U.S. does the exact same thing as Canada? What would happen to Ford, GM, and all the other American-based companies?
Yeah, I think we have to think about these things in the short, medium, and long terms. The short term is going to be a shock to the system. They're going to have to up their game. There probably will be some pain for these industries. But I think that Americans are very competitive and that they can rise to the occasion. We've seen this before with the U.S. auto industry. I think the competition from, say, Japanese imports back in the 70s and 80s ultimately made the U.S. a more competitive industry. One thing that's also helped the U.S. auto industry is NAFTA or the USMCA, whatever you want to call it. Integration with North American supply chains, the ability to work with our Canadian and Mexican neighbors to competitively produce cars has been a big boost. So let's learn from that and let's look for ways to reduce their input costs and ways to make them more competitive. Then also we have to think about Americans and what if we had access to cheaper EVs and all the gains from that. So that needs to factor into the equation as well.
Let me just step away from trade policies and legislation for just a minute and get your outlook on how inflation and perhaps free trade is going to progress in the United States. What is your current sentiment, and are you optimistic for economic growth in the U.S. overall?
Well, I think the United States, has been an economic powerhouse for quite a while. I don't think the fundamental conditions have changed that would cause it to reverse course. Certainly, there are challenges, and one of these is trade policy. What is the long-term outlook for trade policy? We've unfortunately dipped our toes into the protectionist waters in recent years, if not just plunged right into them. I'm hoping that this will be a learning experience for Americans, that we backed away from free trade, decided to try out protectionism. And it's very difficult to make the case. This has worked out very well for us. And I'm hoping that this will produce a renewed appreciation for the benefits of free trade and the lowering of trade barriers. And if we can learn that lesson and reverse course, then I think I'm fairly optimistic about the country's future.
Well, what do you think has contributed to American exceptionalism over the last 100 years? Well, more specifically, 70 years since World War II.
Yeah, I think one underappreciated factor behind American growth is that the United States is a huge country and a huge economy, and we have free trade among our states. Many of our states have GDPs, and not all of them, they're equivalent to other foreign countries, significant foreign countries. And the fact that we can trade amongst ourselves as I think is part of the formula for growth we've seen, having a relatively low levels of regulation. The fact that we are a country, while other countries, for example, have turned their back on fossil fuels, and the United States, with the fracking boom, I think has been a huge tailwind for growth here. The fact that we've had historically open position on immigration, our ability to attract talent from over the world has been, again, traditionally another factor for success. Unfortunately, I think we've backed away from that, turned our back a bit on the benefits of immigration and foreign talent. Again, I'm hoping that's another lesson that we'll learn and we'll reverse course on, having touched the stove on that and found how hot it is. So, yeah, I think the U.S. has benefited from a number of factors, and I'm optimistic those still remain in place and can serve as a foundation for future growth.
Does the United States still need free trade and ultimately globalization moving forward? Let me play for you a clip of Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick at the WEF earlier this year. Take a listen.
You should start at a much higher level.
Okay.
We are in Davos at the World Economic Forum. And the Trump administration and myself, we are here to make a very clear point. Globalization has failed the West and the United States of America. It's a failed policy. It is what the WEF has stood for, which is export, offshore, far shore. Find the cheapest labor in the world, and the world is a better place for it. The fact is, it has left America behind. It has left the American workers behind. And what we are here to say is that America First is a different model, one that we encourage other countries to consider, which is that our workers come first. We can have policies that impact our workers. Sovereignty is your borders. You're entitled to have borders. You shouldn't offshore your medicine. You shouldn't offshore your semiconductors. You shouldn't offshore your entire industrial base and have it be hollowed out beneath you. You should not be dependent for that which is fundamental to your sovereignty on.
Can you just evaluate his America First policy that he's talking about, and ultimately his core thesis that globalization has failed?
Yeah, it's interesting to me that Secretary Lutnick did not provide any facts or any numbers to back up any of his assertions. I think there's a good reason for that. They simply don't work. Pick your metric. Look at American personal income, household income, family income, all trending up and have been for decades. He talks about manufacturing. The United States is the world's #2 manufacturing country behind only China, a country that has something like 3 to 4 times the population that we do. If you look at American manufacturing output, it's at or near an all-time high. You look at industrial capacity. If you look at manufacturing value added, it's at an all-time high. By all kinds of metrics, Americans are doing better than ever. And I think globalization is part of the explanation, is part of the reason. I recall that a couple of years ago, The Economist magazine had a cover story that said, "America, the envy of the world." This was before all the tariffs were imposed. So, we hear a lot of rhetoric, but not a lot of facts to support them about the evils of globalization.
Well, are there certain countries, I don't know if you want to name specific ones, but just in theory, are there certain countries that a nation should not be trading with? By a nation, I mean specifically the U.S.?
No, I don't think there's any country that we should not be trading with. There may be certain products, certain goods that we don't want to engage in trade with. So, for example, it's probably not wise policy for the United States to purchase its Navy ships from China. That makes sense to me. There are certain narrow restrictions that I think can be entertained and pass a national security test. But I think trade, as a free trade, as a general principle, should be the default position. And in fact, I think there's good literature to suggest it's also international security interests by reducing the chances of conflict. It's not a guarantee. I think countries that trade together are less likely to go to war with one another. So I think from a variety of perspectives, it serves. And one last thing, Cuba. I mean, this is a country we do not trade with. I think some very small agricultural trade. It's hard for me to make the case that has been a successful policy in either formulating change for Cuba, improving the position of the Cuban people, achieving any of our foreign policy goals. So yes, I think that trade should be the default position with perhaps some narrow exceptions here and there.
Well, we all had to study David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage in school. Theory states, broadly speaking, that nations benefit with trade or from trade by trading with each other if they specialize in certain goods. If a country is better at producing one good versus the other, they should sell that good and buy something else that the other country is better at producing at. Is there a chance in the future in which technology allows the U.S. or any other country to have an absolute advantage over all goods, thereby eliminating the need for trade?
I'm very skeptical of that. Technology has been progressing and improving for generations, and yet we haven't come to a place like that. It's difficult for me to imagine a scenario in which that no longer holds, that we no longer specialize. And in fact, I suspect that globalization and technology may increase specialization by decreasing barriers to trade and reducing transaction costs.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Colin. Tell us a little bit about your work and where we can find your work.
Yes, so I'm Colin Grabow over at the Cato Institute. I can be found on X or Twitter at CP Grabow. And you can find all my work on Cato's website as well.
All right. We'll put the links down below, so make sure to follow Colin and the Cato Institute. Welcome to the show, Colin. It's good to have you, and I look forward to having you back on again. Take care for now.
All right, Dave. Enjoy the conversation. You take care as well.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe.